WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
I've roamed and rambled, and I followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts. And all around me, a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me.
Making whiskey at George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon means making it the old-school way, as in the way they made it in 1797, by hand.
We're using some high technology here.
Yeah, high technology.
And when these modern-day distillers gathered at Mount Vernon to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the distillery's restoration, they laid down rye whiskey using the original Mount Vernon recipe and the same process used 220 years ago.
It goes in the fermenters first. Always a little bit of cold water, then hot water, then they send corn. Whenever honey buckets go in, and then it gets followed with the rye and then the malt.
No machines, pumps, or plumbing to go from grain to glass. But that's not entirely unfamiliar to some of the distillers who came from around the United States.
This is a lot closer to what it was like in the early prototype days, which I was happy to leave behind. No, this is really something. The whole site is amazing. I mean, this is with the historic distillery and the mill. I mean, seeing the mill is incredible.
Back in Washington's day, the grist mill was a major part of the estate, grinding flour for the general's cooks and selling the surplus. But the fact that the grist mill existed made the distillery possible.
You know, you think of Washington, kind of the mythic figure, the general, the president, but he ran an 8,000-acre estate for all of his life. And the last part of his life, he got into the whiskey business. So the interesting thing here is even at the age of 65, he's looking for new businesses, new ways to make an income. And of course, whiskey was a good, profitable business. But the key figure here that he hired was James Anderson, the Scottish farm manager. He had experience as a distiller. So when Washington hires him, that's when this business becomes possible. But still, General Washington had to approve of it, and he did. And they did some distilling in the cooperage that first year, which led to the building of a dedicated distillery with 5 stills. The amazing thing about the history here is 11,000 gallons in 1 year in 1799. It's a pretty tremendous production rate for any distillery.
In fact, Washington's distillery was one of the largest in the early days of the United States for a brief time. After Washington died in 1799, the distillery gradually stopped making whiskey and burned to the ground in 1814. Archaeologists uncovered the foundation between 1999 and 2006 with funding from the Distilled Spirits Council, and after 2 years of construction, the restored distillery opened in 2007. But distilling here resumed a few years before that. Veteran distillers like Dave Pickerel and Joe Dangler used this old still out on the lawn next to the distillery site back in 2003.
We overfired the still, and it wound up cooking the bottom of the still, the solids in the still. And I'll remember Tom Sherman, Dave Pickerel, myself, Ron Cole, were around the still. And Tom Sherman looked inside with a chuckle, said, "Hey, you guys made cornbread. That's what he called it, cornbread." He said, "You just made a good batch of cornbread." So we proceeded to get our hands as deeply in the stills as we could, whatever instruments we had, and scrape everything out. And I think I got some citric acid and we boiled it and cleaned it up and got running again. But those kind of things, surprises, but again, there's stories to tell.
And when the first bottle of that whiskey went on the auction block a couple of years later, it sold for $100,000. with all of the money going to fund educational programs at Mount Vernon, a practice that continues to this day.
We still do tons of tours and have a lot of our angle on education, but this is really a working distillery, and we work at the 18th century way, as you've seen, so it's a lot of hard work in here.
There is something else that we must talk about when we talk about George Washington's distillery to be historically accurate. Today there are a lot of master distillers at this distillery on the anniversary, but back in the day there was only one master, General Washington. This distillery was operated largely by slave labor.
We teach that every day here at Mount Vernon because these folks that lived and worked on the plantation made this operation go. And without those folks here working, he couldn't have achieved all that he achieved at home, but also on a broader scale. We have an exhibit right now at Mount Vernon in our museum called Lives Bound Together. It's been in our museum for 2 years. It's the story of all the slaves at Mount Vernon. And so we tell that story every day. It's a very important story. And this distillery wouldn't have worked with the 6 young men in here that were working every day to make the whiskey. And in the ledger, they're listed as distillers. So I think the role of African Americans in the whiskey business goes back in many areas of the country. And I think Jack Daniels recently released some information about that. So it's important to recognize all of that and teach history as it was.
Those 6 slaves made about 11,000 gallons of whiskey in 1 year. Today, the distillery makes about 1,500 gallons a year.
We can even see the number of people that he had is about the right number of people, and it's a make sense number of people. More than that, and they just kind of tend to get in each other's way. Less than that, and you're running around doing too many things.
We did put the rest of the rye in, right? Yeah, we got
That's not the case on this day. There's an old saying that too many cooks can spoil the soup. But in this case, too many distillers did not spoil the whiskey.
Once you got it kind of dialed in, you just let it go.
Mount Vernon's team of full-time distillers gently guided their guests through the process of making whiskey by hand using wood-fired stills, where it takes a gentle touch instead of precision.
An interesting piece of equipment compared to all the new industrial stuff you got.
Far cry from what you've got in Lawrenceburg, right?
Oh, far cry. Same principles, same physics.
This is soul food for me. I was able to come out here 2 years ago, and I've made every distilling season since then. I don't stay as long as I'd like to every time, but yeah, this is it. It's basic. It's all the basic stuff.
The first time it took us, from 8 a.m. until 10, 11 o'clock at night sometimes, and we were working here. I remember sitting in front of this still here, just waiting for the still to get done. And I was so tired. I was sitting on a 10-gallon barrel, and I fell asleep in front of the still. Steve's got a picture of me just slumped over in front of the still. But the days were just interminably long. And we've got the workflow set and the pace set now so that everything just flows smoothly. And the spirit comes off the still. It's really good quality spirit. And, I could drink it right off the still any day.
And that's just the way General Washington wanted it back in the day. Back then, they did not mature their whiskey in barrels.
Great little operation you guys got here. This is cool.
It was sold as unaged, raw, fiery whiskey, perfect for the time. They still sell it that way at Mount Vernon's gift shops, but the whiskey being made on this day will be allowed to mature for a couple of years. And when the time's right, it'll also be sold to raise money to continue the mission of Mount Vernon.
That's good.
For more cask-strength conversation on whiskeys, with the people who make them and the people who drink them, join us each week for WhiskyCast. In Mount Vernon, Virginia, I'm Mark Gillespie.